If we listen to Democrats, it seems we understand a lot about racism. For example, we know that nobody is born a racist. Racism is learned. The young child does not recognize race, and indeed, if a person of Caucasian parents is brought up with Chinese foster parents or adopted into a Oriental family, for all intents and purposes, they become Oriental or Chinese or whatever the culture of their parent is. And the same goes for other races. So race is not entirely linked with biological attributes or characteristics. Culture is also a part of, race is also a part of culture, in that being white is not just a skin color, it's a culture. Um, and again, the narrative that Democrats and liberals put out about race conflicts to some extent with what we know about culture, because if all whites are racists, but all other races aren't racist, then what happens with Caucasians brought up in a Chinese or a Jamaican or a different culture, a different family? Is it their skin culture? Does that impact their whole life more than their upbringing? Because if racism is taught, how can a white person brought up in a family of African Americans or black people, how can they be taught to be racist against blacks? Who is teaching them? So the narrative that all white people have white privilege and are racist is difficult to um, make sense of within the narrative on culture. But if racism is taught and we all learn to be racist or learn not to be racist, and if we can teach people not to be racist, where did racism originate from? Because if children are not born racist, and if it has to be taught to them, who taught racism? Who were the original racists, and why were they racist? Racism from the liberal position, in terms of how the liberals think of racism, doesn't make sense. It's not an explanatory hypothesis. It's simply an observation that some people don't like people of strange cultures and characteristics. And to say that this is an attribute only of white races is prima facie a racist. How can only white people prefer their race? If that was true, there would only be whites and some other mixture. There wouldn't be black people and yellow people and red people And if it was true, a city wouldn't have diversity. It would have a white area and the amalgamated races, but all races, all cultures prefer to create their own environment. And this is the weakness of this whole racial narrative. It's not the race that is separating people, it's the culture. People who are less fixated on their culture will try other foods, will have more friends of diverse backgrounds, and so on. It's not the color of the skin that determines who one associates with, it's one's culture. So a person who is genetically white could theoretically be a racist against whites in terms of their culture, meaning that they may be so embedded in the culture of their birth that they may actually reject white culture despite the sameness of their skin tones. So the arguments made about race doesn't lead to any kind of solution. To simply say whites are racists is to say our culture naturally excludes other races and preferentially rewards those of that culture. But that's obvious and it's natural. It would have to be so, otherwise there wouldn't be the different cultures. So the attack on white racism is really an attack on white culture and its successes, let's say, its preponderance in the world. But the question is, are other cultures able to claim or access or enjoy the benefits of white culture without adopting the culture? Because this is what the dilemma appears to be, is that other cultures want to take over the benefits of Western ways of living without adopting the Western milieu, the Western way of thinking, the Western values. And I think this is what is causing the frustration and the anger and the dilemma, because to simply mark it down to skin color totally misses the whole problem, and it simplifies the problem into something that isn't really going to solve the issue. Saying we need to stop white people from being white and we need to teach them to be less white does not solve the problem of how do we wholesale transport or shift Western culture into other arenas. And obviously it really can't be done, because the culture isn't about skin color, it's about values and it's about systems. And until we deal with this and the cultural disparities and the fact that some cultures are better than others, we're not going to solve the problem. And to say it's a problem for white people to solve really demonstrates just how deep the problem of culture is. Because white culture, Western culture, cannot solve the problem of why other cultures don't function as well. You know, it's not our problem. It, we solved a problem of how to live reasonably well, not perfectly, but reasonably well. And if the culture one is in cannot compete against the culture of the West, then the culture of the West needs to be adopted wholesale, not just in its goodies, not just in its materials, but also in its thinking patterns.